Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Crusaders, Gangsters, and Whiskey, Prohibition in Memphis, by Patrick O'Daniel, narrated by Johnny Heller. Publisher's note: in this audio edition, you may hear references to visual elements present in the print and ebook formats of the book. Introduction. No political, economic, or moral issue has so engrossed and divided all the people of America as the Prohibition problem, except the issue of slavery. Mabel Walker Willebrandt, U.S. Assistant Attorney General. The night air was hot, humid, and filled with the sound of cicadas. Deadly water moccasins lived in the woods by the creek, and anyone walking through them had to watch where he stepped. The lookouts hid in the trees and undergrowth and settled in for a long night. The men swatted away the swarms of bloodthirsty mosquitoes as they kept careful watch over the moonlit trails leading to the still. They stood ready to fire off warning shots from their rifles at the first sign of Prohibition agents, sheriff's deputies, or hijackers. They knew that if any raider made it past them undetected, their comrades could lose their freedom or their lives. A short way up the trail, the moonshiners poured foul-smelling mash into a copper still. The mixture of water, cornmeal, sugar, and yeast had been fermenting in a buried vat for weeks. With the still full, they prepared a fire and stoked the flames until the boiling mash released its alcoholic vapor. The mist rose into the cap, moved through a copper line, and filtered through water in a barrel called the thumper. The fumes drifted through the worm, a coiled copper tube submerged in another water-filled barrel, where it cooled and liquefied. They discarded the toxic methanol-laced first drops and filled bottles with the rest of the clear liquid as it dripped from the copper coil. It was the night's first batch of corn liquor, or, as they liked to call it, white mule. Some dismissed moonshining as just a gimmick to make easy money, but for bootleggers during Prohibition, it was a high-risk venture with a tremendous profit potential. Capitalism, like nature, abhors a vacuum. Prohibition took legal liquor away, but the desire for alcohol remained, and bootleggers gladly stepped in and filled the demand. Statewide prohibition took effect in Tennessee in 1909 after years of agitation by temperance organizations. Even after the National Prohibition Act ran its course, from 1920 to 1933, Tennessee's anti-liquor laws remained in effect until 1939. Prohibitionists believed outlawing alcohol would make the country safer and more productive and improve the lives of women and children. They succeeded in the legislative arena, but in their naivete, they did not understand that passage of a law did not guarantee its enforcement. Despite harsh penalties, bootlegging flourished, and the country entered a period of unparalleled illegal drinking and law-breaking. In the end, everything that could go wrong with Prohibition went wrong, and few places illustrate that failure better than Memphis. Prohibition was one of the most important issues to affect Memphis after the American Civil War, and at the same time, it is one of the least understood in the city's history. Few events other than the Civil Rights Movement had a more significant and longer-lasting impact. Even so, few written accounts were kept, and most oral histories were little more than conjecture. The lack of adequate source material has led to shortcomings in the historiography of Prohibition in Memphis. Historians pulled information from the same small pool of stories and repeated them until readers no longer questioned their authenticity, accuracy, or thoroughness. Making this observation is not to say that any history of Memphis is flawed, but rather it is to say that previous accounts only provide a limited explanation of this critical period. Bootlegging defined the failure of Prohibition in the 1920s and 1930s, and many historians maintain that bootlegging was an extension of Edward Hull Crump's political machine and functioned under its protection to support it financially. Sharon Wright wrote, "Crump soon created a machine which sustained itself on corruption. During the age of Prohibition, his administration accepted bribes from brothel, gambling houses, and saloon owners." Roger Biles wrote, "The necessary funds for Crump's organization materialized in the form of protection payoffs collected from gamblers, prostitutes, and liquor dealers operating in blatant violation of Tennessee Prohibition statutes." Michael Honey wrote, "Crump built his political machine by collecting money from illegal gambling dens, houses of prostitution, and during Prohibition, from illegal liquor joints. Crump was ousted as mayor in 1916 for non-enforcement of statewide prohibition, but regained control of the city's administration in 1927. When law enforcement under Crump did not bring down bootlegging, many assumed that it was not because of ineffectiveness, but rather because the powerful urban boss deliberately allowed bootlegging to continue. In 1936, Time published an article that claimed the Crump dynasty is supposed to be financed by various forms of protection money from bootleggers, gamblers, et al. The notion of collusion continued to appear in subsequent histories of Memphis. David Tucker wrote, "With Crump back in power, Memphis once again developed a powerful underworld. Bootleggers, gambling houses, pimps, prostitutes, and policymen thrived under the protection of the machine." William Worley and Ernest Withers wrote, "When Tennessee Prohibition ended in 1939, Crump's ability to control aspects of city life through the bootlegger network came to an end." Bootlegging, however, was a much more complex phenomenon. A day-by-day study of news reports and documents of the period brings into question the assumption that bootleggers operated with the consent of the machine or for its benefit. No one can say to what extent Crump's political machine, the Shelby County organization, accepted money from criminals. However, Crump's men did not and could not force every bootlegger to pay tribute to the organization. Furthermore, Crump became politically powerful, but not powerful enough to protect bootleggers from the federally controlled Prohibition Bureau. Contrary to rumors spread by critics, Crump became wealthy and powerful without the help of bootleggers. He married into a well-to-do family, invested in the Coca-Cola Company, and started a leading real estate insurance company. Crump built political support by developing relations with business elites and business-oriented progressives with the goal of making Memphis the most important commercial center in the South. Considering these findings, we must ask ourselves how much we truly know about the failure of Prohibition in Memphis. If the Crump machine was not behind bootlegging, who was? This book offers a fresh look at those responsible for the rise and fall of Prohibition, its effect on Memphis, and the impact that events in the city had on the rest of the state and country. The first chapter covers the rise of local chapters of the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Anti-Saloon League and their campaign for a ban on alcoholic beverages. It includes the city's role in state efforts and the violent death of the movement's beloved martyr. The next chapters deal with the fall of the saloons and the city's gangsters who inspired the local Prohibition movement. Chapters 2 and 3 cover the efforts to enforce statewide prohibition in Memphis and the resistance to the law. They include the relationship between saloons, politicians, and the ouster of Mayor Crump. Chapter 4 examines the more notorious saloon owners and gangsters who embodied the lawlessness and moral decline described in temperance rhetoric. Chapters 5, 6, and 7 explore the rise of bootlegging and the corruption of law enforcement. Newly appointed administrators struggled to enforce the unpopular law and bring down a shadowy criminal organization led by one of their own. The country faced the first assessment of prohibition in the federal courts in Memphis in what Americans should have seen as a test case for national prohibition. Chapter 8 covers the attempts by federal, county, and city law enforcement to combat bootlegging. It includes the arrival of the U.S. Bureau of Internal Revenue's Prohibition Unit, the federal entity created to enforce the liquor law that became the Prohibition Bureau in March 1927. The reorganization of the police department and Shelby County Sheriff Will Knight's efforts to stop moonshining. Some officers gave in to temptation and took bribes from bootleggers. Others, frustrated by the inadequacies of the law, found extra-legal means to mete out rough and ready justice on local gangsters. Chapters 9 through 12 look at problems resulting from the uneven enforcement of prohibition. The brunt of enforcement fell on African Americans, immigrants, the working class, and the poor, while the wealthiest used their influence to skirt the law. Others used medical and religious exemptions as means to circumvent the law to acquire alcohol, while the poorest people risked injury and death by drinking industrial alcohol laced with toxic additives or tainted moonshine. The Ku Klux Klan used the prohibition issue to veil their attempts to intimidate immigrants and African Americans, and youthful rebellion against the hypocritical liquor law grew into a disregard for all laws. Chapters 13 and 14 explore the places that took on the role of the saloon and their clientele's steadfast resistance to Prohibition. Social drinking, in defiance of the law, gave rise to new gathering places. Restaurants transformed into roadhouses and nightclubs, with crowds of scofflaws dancing to the music of jazz orchestras. Corn whiskey and home-brew beer flowed freely in brothels and gambling halls as their proprietors became a new kind of bootlegger. Chapters 15 through 17 cover the gangsters, scandals, and warfare among the bootleggers. Joe Sailors ran a moonshine operation, protected through bribery, intimidation, and murder, out of President's Island, a 7,500-acre island in the Mississippi River just south of Memphis. John Bilwamini oversaw a gang that produced thousands of gallons of liquor a week. A misplaced ledger with the names of bribed police officers discovered by Prohibition agents set in motion a series of events that brought down his empire and shook the public's faith in law enforcement. Violence broke out among rival bootlegging gangs after Ed Crump's political machine, the Shelby County Organization, inadvertently interfered in the corn liquor market. The resulting war brought about the demise of the liquor barons and a purge of the old liquor interests from the organization. The final chapters deal with the roles of Memphians in Prohibition repeal in 1939. They explore the rise of the repeal movement and the desperate attempts to save Prohibition by the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Anti-Saloon League. Law enforcement's inability to bring leading bootleggers to justice helped build the case for repeal. The police department all but gave up its fight against liquor traffickers as politicians gave in to the demands to use liquor as a new revenue source. As the ban on liquor faded, a new bootlegging stood poised on the horizon. Prohibition, with all its crime, corruption, and cultural upheaval, ran its course after 13 years in most of the rest of the country. But in Memphis, it lasted from 1909 until 1939. Crusaders, Gangsters, and Whiskey explores those tumultuous decades. The failure of Prohibition in Memphis deserves a careful study because of its impact on the city, state, and country. How did Prohibition affect Memphis? Why did it fail, and how was that failure important? The answers lie in the lives of the people involved, the people who fought for Prohibition, the people who fought against it, and the people who profited from it. And their story begins with a gunfight. Chapter 1. The Rise of the White Ribbons. Temperate temperance is best. Intemperate temperance injures the cause of temperance, while temperate temperance helps it in its fight against intemperate intemperance. Fanatics will never learn that, though it be written in letters of gold across the sky. Mark Twain, 1896. Edward Ward Carmack was about to become a martyr. Of course, he had no idea this was about to happen. It was just the end of another typical day at the office where he worked as the editor of the Nashville newspaper, The Tennessean. He finished up, locked his door, and began to walk home along the crowded streets on an otherwise pleasant afternoon on November 9th, 1908. The tall, red-haired Carmack had begun his law career in Columbia, Tennessee, and served as a member of the lower house of the state legislature in Nashville in 1885. He found an outlet for his political opinions as editor of the Columbia Herald, the Nashville American in 1888, and the Memphis Daily Commercial in 1892. Carmack's caustic personality and no-holds-barred approach caused many hard feelings, including those of W.A. Collier, editor of the rival Memphis newspaper, The Appeal Avalanche. Carmack's stand on the issue of silver cemented his reputation as a firebrand. He joined the crusade to increase the money supply through silver coinage to offset the panic and depression. In 1896, he resigned from the recently merged Commercial Appeal because 3 of the 5 owners of the newspaper swayed the local Democratic Party to nominate pro-gold standard Josiah Patterson to U.S. Congress for a 4th term. Tennessee's so-called Silver Democrats withdrew from the party and nominated Carmack. After a long battle, Carmack eventually won, but made an enemy of Patterson's son Malcolm, who became governor. Carmack served 2 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives and began a term as a U.S. Senator in 1901. Carmack challenged Malcolm Patterson in his 1908 re-election campaign, so the Democrats took the unusual step of holding a gubernatorial primary. Prohibition became the deciding factor, and each candidate stood firmly entrenched on his side of the issue. Carmack represented the rural prohibitionists, and Patterson represented the urban opposition. Patterson won the nomination and the election, while prohibitionist candidates won the state legislature. Carmack remained editor of the Tennessean, where he continued his attacks on Patterson and his advisor, Colonel Duncan Cooper. Cooper had hired Carmack as editor of the Nashville American in 1888, but the two became political opponents after Cooper sided with Patterson. Carmack, true to form, used his newspaper to attack Cooper's integrity and influence over the governor. He then accused Patterson of fraud and Cooper of secretly orchestrating an alliance with former Governor John Isaac Cox to sway the election. The blatant attack on his honor infuriated Cooper and made him a bitter enemy. On the afternoon of November 9, 1908, Carmack lit a cigar and left his office headed north on 7th Street with the evening paper under his arm. He stopped in front of the Polk apartment house to speak to friends, Charles and Catherine Eastman. He had just tipped his hat to the lady when he noticed Duncan Cooper and his 27-year-old son Robin across the street. Cooper yelled, "You're trying to hide behind a woman, you coward." Carmack stepped away from Mrs. Eastman, and Robin Cooper stepped in front of his father. Robin Cooper and Carmack both drew revolvers as Mrs. Eastman screamed, "For God's sake, don't shoot." Both men opened fire. One bullet struck Robin Cooper in the shoulder and another missed. 2 bullets struck Carmack in the chest. The 3rd bullet from Robin Cooper's pistol hit Carmack in the back of the neck and exited through the mouth as he spun around from the impacts of the first 2 shots. Cooper staggered to the ground wounded, and Carmack fell into the gutter. Dr. McFeeters Glasgow rushed to the scene, examined Carmack, and pronounced him dead. Colonel Cooper rushed his wounded son to Dr. R.G. Fort's office to call for an ambulance. Police arrested the Coopers on charges of second-degree murder and former Sheriff John Sharp with aiding and abetting. The Coopers claimed they met Carmack by chance while walking to the state capitol in response to a telephone call from Governor Patterson. Vengeful Carmack supporters insisted the Coopers were guilty of premeditated murder. The Memphis News Scimitar accused Patterson of complicity and suggested he had promised Cooper a pardon in advance. The jury acquitted John Sharp in March 1909, but, after much debate, found both Coopers guilty. The judge sentenced each to 20 years in the state penitentiary. Duncan Cooper appealed, but the state Supreme Court upheld the decision. Patterson, however, issued a pardon within the hour. He maintained that the elder Cooper, who never drew his pistol during the fight, did not receive a fair trial. A second jury acquitted Robin Cooper on November 15, 1910, despite the uproar from temperance supporters who wanted him imprisoned. He won his freedom as well as many enemies. He made the news again on August 19, 1919, when unknown assailants beat him to death and left his body in his car. Carmack supporters held memorial services across the state the Sunday after his death. 7,000 people crowded into Ryman Auditorium in Nashville to sing hymns, listen to speeches, and solemnly resolve in Carmack's memory to drive the liquor power from the state of Tennessee. Mourners claimed the liquor interests assassinated their champion, and his death was a call to arms. Charles D. Johns conveyed the meaning of Carmack's death in his book, Tennessee's Pond of Liquor and Pool of Blood. There's not a day that passed since the blood of the peerless Carmack, made flow by an assassin's bullet, dampened the ground on that now hallowed spot on 7th Avenue, Nashville, Tennessee, that many interested in grieving strangers do not visit the scene of the lamented senator's last moments on earth, where he was shot down almost without warning in the prime of his manhood and in the midst of his usefulness to his state and country as a leader and statesman. Do you not feel the presence of his great spirit as you stand there and recall the whole affair? Do you not experience the peculiar sensation of being on sacred ground when you remember the greatness of the man whose life ebbed away there on that spot, while the pistols of his assassins were yet smoking? Carmack's violent death caused outrage across Tennessee and the country. Prohibitionists labeled the shooting an assassination and framed Carmack as a slain martyr. Public opinion in Tennessee, incited by temperance propaganda, shifted in favor of prohibition. The temperance movement in the United States originally aimed to curb excessive alcohol consumption, but after decades of unresponsiveness from the government and the public, members shifted their focus to building enough support to force a legal ban on all alcohol consumption. Temperance workers had a genuine cause for concern. In 1830, the average 15-year-old boy consumed nearly 7 gallons of alcohol a year, 3 times the average of modern Americans. Adults drank far more. Alcohol played a role in missed work, on-the-job injuries, workmanship, higher crime rates, and domestic violence. Women suffered the most, since they had few legal rights and depended on drinking fathers and husbands for support. The rising indignation of wives and mothers across the country gave rise to the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU, in 1874 in Cleveland, Ohio. Members chose the white ribbon bow to symbolize purity and took pledges of abstinence from alcohol and later tobacco and narcotics. The WCTU, under Annie Turner Whitmire, opened chapters across the country with the slogan, "Agitate, Educate, Legislate." The WCTU became a formidable force, especially after its members allied with Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and other women battling for women's suffrage. The organization, later led by Frances Willard, lobbied to restrict alcohol sales, created anti-alcohol programs for children, and campaigned for state legislation against alcohol. Under pressure from the WCTU, North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, and Rhode Island adopted Prohibition laws, and Kansas legislators wrote Prohibition into their Constitution in 1880. Georgia passed statewide Prohibition in 1907, followed by Oklahoma in 1907, Mississippi in 1908, North Carolina in 1908, Tennessee in 1909, and West Virginia in 1912. The WCTU claimed significant successes, but its goal of a nationwide ban remained just out of reach. The campaign for a Prohibition amendment to the United States Constitution gained momentum with the formation of the Anti-Saloon League, ASL, in 1893. Under the shrewd and ruthless leadership of Wayne Wheeler, the ASL became the country's most successful single-issue lobbying organization intent on destroying the saloon's influence on society and politics. An ASL member wrote, "A prohibitionary law puts the saloon where it can't fight back. It removes the saloon from politics by removing it from existence." The ASL harnessed both morality and patriotism for its cause. ASL propaganda took advantage of the rising anti-German fervor and framed beer brewers as German sympathizers. Thinking ahead, prohibitionists supported the income tax amendment in 1913 to cover revenue expected to be lost when the breweries closed. Most politicians dared not defy the ASL as the proposed 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, the ban on alcohol consumption, stood on the verge of ratification by both houses of Congress. In Tennessee, the battle over alcohol began with the founding of the state in 1796. The first laws limited amounts sold, limited sales to African Americans, and outlawed drunkenness. More laws followed as the temperance movement begun by Quakers and Congregationists spread from the Northeast into Tennessee in the 1820s. Legislation following the Civil War introduced high taxes and local option laws and outlawed the sale of alcohol near schools and churches. The effort by the Tennessee Temperance Alliance nearly succeeded in enacting a Prohibition amendment to the state constitution in 1887. Prohibitionists despised Memphis' saloons, with their stand-up bars with big mirrors, polished mahogany, brass rails, and spittoons. The city had over 150 such places by 1899, for a population of just over 100,000. Even groceries sold 10-cent cups of whiskey from a barrel kept behind the store counter or in the back room. Saloons played a big part in the business life of the city in the 19th century, and many of the city's elite invested in the liquor trade. For example, Robert R. Church, Sr. became the South's first African-American millionaire after coming to Memphis during the Civil War. He invested in real estate and founded the Solvent Savings Bank and Trust in 1906. However, his first business successes came from running some of the busiest saloons and brothels on Beale Street. Elizabeth Fisher Johnson established Tennessee's first WCTU chapter in Memphis in 1876 and collected 6,000 abstinence pledges. Membership flagged because of the yellow fever epidemic in 1878 until Frances Willard's visit to the city in 1881. In 1882, Johnson joined forces with a newly formed Nashville chapter to create a statewide organization. The Tennessee WCTU then became the most powerful component of the Tennessee Temperance Alliance, an organization of Methodist, Baptist, and Presbyterian churches that rallied support for a Prohibition amendment to the state constitution in 1887. Lyde Meriwether, wife of Memphis civil engineer Niles Meriwether, became president of the 75-member Memphis WCTU after Johnson died in April 1883. Meriwether had joined only 4 months earlier and had never spoken in public until attending a WCTU convention in Arkansas. To her surprise, she became a powerful speaker and leader. She created an effective propaganda tool by organizing children into bands of hope in Memphis and other communities in Tennessee to carry the message about the evils of strong drink. With her encouragement, African-American women formed chapters and later organized the Sojourner Truth of Tennessee State Union at the state convention on September 21, 1886. Prohibition divided African-Americans as deeply as whites in Tennessee during the 1887 campaign. Those who supported Prohibition organized within churches and colleges, especially Fisk University, Roger Williams University, and Tennessee Central College. Many black Tennesseans heeded the appeals of Fisk University founder General Clinton Fisk and Frederick Douglass to join the cause. Many in Memphis, however, proved harder to sway. Prohibition is a slave law, as it puts some in bondage and leaves others to do as they please, wrote an editorialist from the African-American newspaper The Watchman. Another black Memphian said, "I fought the rebels for my freedom, and I'll fight again before I will let the prohibitionists take away my rights." The Memphis WCTU continued to meet and even opened a lunchroom for shop girls in 1887, but interest began to fade by 1900. Ada Wallace Unruh, president of the Oregon chapter of the WCTU, spoke at the Court Street Presbyterian Church in Memphis in 1898 to an enthusiastic crowd. She returned to the city 2 years later and spoke at the Central Baptist Church. The meager reception left Unruh disappointed. She said it was the smallest audience she had addressed in her 20 years of temperance work. In 1902, Reverend John Royal Harris, state ASL superintendent, announced in Memphis, "We have arrived at last." The Tennessee branch of the ASL revitalized the anti-liquor movement by recruiting members of both political parties to force passage of increasingly stricter laws. Pro-ASL legislators began by outlawing alcohol sales within 4 miles of any school in rural Tennessee. They next enacted bans on alcohol sales in towns with populations less than 2,000 people in 1887 and on the state capitol grounds in 1901. The 1903 Adams Act extended the 4-mile law to towns with populations of 5,000, banned liquor sales within 4 miles of soldiers' homes, limited liquor to inmates of public institutions, and made non-payment of U.S. Internal Revenue tax or non-possession of an Internal Revenue stamp evidence of guilt in all prosecutions. In 1907, Senator Isaac Lewis Pendleton introduced a bill to extend the 4-mile law to cities of more than 150,000 people. It passed the Tennessee Senate by a vote of 26-5, and the Tennessee House of Representatives with a vote of 71-24. Prohibitionists held a mass meeting in Memphis beginning January 17, 1908. WCTU Vice President Mary H. Armour arrived 2 days later to speak at the Central Baptist Church. Unlike the earlier visit by Ada Unruh, Armour met with an enthusiastic response. The meeting ended with a rousing rendition of Tennessee's Going Dry, a popular temperance song sung to the tune of Bringing in the Sheaves, that reportedly left the whole church trembling. A series of debates between Edward Carmack and Malcolm Patterson drew enthusiastic crowds who turned out to cheer and heckle the celebrity candidates. The two squared off at Ellis Auditorium in Memphis on May 30, 1908, in front of a rowdy crowd of 8,000 people. Carmack argued for state prohibition, while Patterson argued for the local option, the more moderate stance of allowing individual communities to decide whether to allow alcohol. Meanwhile, prohibitionist newspaper editorialists appealed to white racism by blaming saloons and distillers for supposed sex crimes committed by African Americans. Methodist clergyman Horace Mellor DuBose wrote in the Nashville newspaper The Tennessean about the death of a Texas woman at the hands of a black saloon lounger. In June 1908, the minister seized upon an article by Will Irwin in Collier's magazine about the rape and murder of a 14-year-old girl by a drunken African-American man in Louisiana. Irwin accused the Lee Levy Gin Company and other liquor producers of marketing to black men with suggestive pictures of white women on their labels. DuBose called upon Tennesseans to set aside all other reasons for the crusade against the saloon and consider this one. the Negro problem. DuBose said, "The effect of the saloon upon the Negro is disastrous to his industry and good citizenship."
Sample complete. Ready to continue?